In this video, we are going to take a look at the history of some of the best deck and archetype that has been released in Master Duel in 2025. I'm going to do a quick rundown for each of them and give you an example deck list of what they look like now at the start of 2026. This is Master Duel in retrospect. The meta at the beginning of 2025 was still mostly being dominated by older decks, as some of the early packs of the year failed to produce a new competitive archetype on their own. The first impactful release of 2025 was the Fiendsmith cards that was released in the Forbidden Liberated pack on February 6, and the second wave of support come in the Wrath of the Tyrant pack released on May 9. Fiendsmith is mostly a fusion and link hybrid archetype that is heavily themed around light fiend monsters. They are intentionally designed to be used as a supplementary engine for other archetypes rather than being their own deck, since they only have two main deck monsters. And to be frank, they are a little bit too good being that. For the history of Fiendsmith, this engine has been a constant in the Master Duel meta ever since its release. It is not in every single meta deck in the game, but it is in a lot of them, and Fiendsmith always make a big impact in every single deck that they are in. They adapt and take on different roles in this kind of deck. Usually, their main purpose would be to provide a bridge into your main archetype, but they can also be used as an extender to put more disruption on the field or to play through or bait some hand trap from the opponent. On the other side of things, they can also enable some pretty degenerate combos as well. The most egregious example of this is that during the early release of Fiendsmith, they were being used to summon Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal, to perform various summon lock and OTKs, which led to Konami finally banning this problematic card. The first meta deck to utilize the power of the Fiendsmith cards was Snake Eyes. Even though this deck took multiple hits on the ban list in the prior year, it still maintained its dominance over the Master Duel meta in the early days of 2025. The Fiendsmith cards were incorporated seamlessly into their deck to show up any of the weakness they had before. You probably already know what Snake Eye does at this point, but for those of you who weren't around for their meta, Snake Eyes is a fire team archetype that is hyper-consistent and efficient at putting a lot of bodies on the field, and they can do so without any restriction, which make them the perfect vessel to abuse generic boss monsters and various fire team support. They also play with the mechanic of placing monsters into the back row as continuous spells to either be used as a form of removal or to gain advantage out of using them as resources. It wasn't the only good deck in the meta at the time, but due to its popularity, Konami does step in with a few restrictions, putting both of their best spells to one copy each and outright banning Snake Eye Oak, which limit the number of monsters they can summon during their combos and reduce their ability for recursion and follow-up plays. Moreover, Appaloosa, one of the best generic monsters in the game, was also banned further down the line. It wasn't because of Snake Eyes specifically, but it still hurt the deck considerably nonetheless. Nowadays, the deck is more rogue than meta. It's not a bad deck by any means, but it cannot compete with some of the later released meta decks. This version I highlight right here is one that stayed the most faithfully with earlier build of Snake Eye Fiendsmith. To make up for some of the consistency the deck has lost, we have the Millennium engine as an easy way to bridge into Fiendsmith, and we are using Chorizo to summon Infernal Flame Banshee with Fiendsmith to go into Snake Eyes. Their typical end mode will usually have a Desiree or Caesar from the Fiendsmith side, an Emblo Whale with Masquerena, plus Promethean Princess. It's not a crazy amount of disruption compared to what this one had in the past, but it would still be enough to win you some games. While Snake Eye took an extended hiatus from the meta since the middle of 2025, this archetype definitely have the potential to come back at any times, especially since it's such a swarmy deck and it can use a lot of cards from the entire Diabell Star lore. So let's just be glad that we can have a break from an entire year of Snake Eye dominance. But while the fires of the Snake Eyes dies out, Fiendsmith only gets stronger and take on a new form with the new support coming out. Stay tuned for the next breakout deck of the year. Remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Here to a wonderful 2026 for Master Duel. The undeniable power and flexibility of Fiendsmith give way for a lot of experimentation with this engine. The deck that stood out the most and gained a lot of popularity during this period was Fiendsmith Control. Back when the Fiendsmith cards were just released, this version of the deck was mostly being played with a Kashira engine without much success. It wasn't until the release of the Primate cards in the Onslaught of the Emperor's Path on April 10 that this deck finally took off. This version of the deck became the norm of Fiendsmith Control because there are a lot of synergies between these two. They both have a lot of recursion power, which means it is really difficult for the opponent to deal with both engines at once if they are being roped into the long game. With the release of Deputy about a month later, on May 9, it also gave Primate a way to bridge into Fiendsmith, which really solidified their gameplay. This is how I would build a Fiendsmith Control deck at the end of 2025. This is definitely a build your own list kind of deck, so there's really no one right way to build a Fiendsmith Control, but this version is one of the more cookie cutter way to play the deck. This deal is a popular inclusion in any type of control list because they provide not only good disruption, but also generate resource with regain. They also have an important function to prolong the game by blocking lethal damage, which help your other engines shine with their recursion power. You'll be surprised of how many different lines and disruptions that this deck can put out. It can play fast game or it can play slow games, and it can play surprisingly well under a lot of pen traps. It doesn't try to do anything broken or unfair, but what makes this deck really good is that it plays really well under modern Yu-Gi-Oh conditions. You can kinda think of it as a deck that counters the game itself rather than a specific deck or meta. Throughout 2025, this deck has decent showing in the meta. It has never been the best deck in the game, and this reflects in the fact that this deck has never been hit by Konami, except for the limitation on the Millennium Golem, which doesn't have anything to do with this deck specifically, but just because the Millennium is a very good engine. Nevertheless, the deck do deserve a spot on this list just because it is one of the most creative decks of 2025. We all know that this day was gonna come. It only took them 20 years and their like 10th wave of support, but Blue Eyes is finally top tier. Released in the Ultimate Sparkle Pack on March 6th, this wave of support includes a couple of new powerful starter cards for Blue Eyes, a few new extender cards, and 2 new powerful end mode pieces. This latest wave of support finally gives Blue Eyes a clear identity and game plan to follow, rather than being just a bunch of random cards without any inherent synergy. They can now very consistently summon a couple of Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon to cheat out powerful Light Dragon Synchro monster from your extra deck, and they can have a few other support pieces to back it up too. But even with all of this, they would still need the support from the Primate engine that was released a month later to become really top tier. With all the pieces of the puzzle together, Blue Eyes actually became the best deck in the game for a little while, mostly due to a lot of its competition were heavily restricted at the time. It even warranted a couple of hits on the ban list from the Konami intern department, semi-limiting Sage and Maiden in White, which were completely unnecessary, because the next couple of decks released following Blue Eyes were on a completely different level that Blue Eyes have no chance to compete with. Blue Eye list at the end of 2025 was still mostly unchanged. The only new inclusion they've had during the year was Kabaman the Legend, which is quite optional to the deck. It raised the power ceiling of the deck a bit, but it also made the deck more bricky to play. It also did get back its third copy of Sage, which is nowhere good enough to make it meta relevant again. But hey, you can always look forward for new support for Blue Eyes, and take comfort in the fact that this deck was the best deck in the game for a little while. Oh boy. Now, let's talk about Malice. For obvious reason, this deck was a dark spot in Master Duel for a lot of people in 2025. People knew that this deck was gonna be good on release, but I don't think anybody really expect that this deck was gonna be as broken as it is. It is so good that it put every single other deck on this list to shame. Malice was basically released in their own pack on the 4th of July. Sadly, the deck is not very liberating for a lot of people, but more the opposite. They also received subsequent support with the Ignitor cards released in the Regeneration of Star pack on September 10th. Malice is a link-focused archetype that has the gimmick of their monster special summoning themselves when they are being banished, which certainly isn't the first archetype in the game to utilize this mechanic. The problem is that Malice or Cybers, which mean the link lock on their monster, are mostly irrelevant, because Cybers is the most powerful typing for link monster in the game. They have incredible monster for extender, and they also have insane boss monster to boot. Not to mention that the Ignitor monster are the most powerful extender for Cybers that we have ever had. The deck is also impervious to almost all hand traps in the game, because they can just easily dodge them with one of their traps, or have an extender to play past them. All of this made for a truly unstoppable Malice when they go first. Besides setting up a lot of powerful disruption on their own, plus abusing cards like Appaloosa, they can also draw into generic hand traps with their Chessy Cat and White Binder. Even if you somehow manage to break their board, if you don't kill them immediately or set up some type of floodgate, they will just kill you the following turn. Because of course, Malice also have an insane recursion power on top of all the other things it can do. Once a Malice Link monster hit the board, they can never truly be outed, because they can always just resummon themselves. Despite clearly being a power outlier, Konami still released Malice fully unrestricted into Master Duel, which made them the best deck in the game ever since their release, and they had never let go of their crown. People were really turned off from the Malice meta, because you were basically forced to play their counter card Artifact Lancia, which turned games against Malice into non-games. Definitely wasn't an enjoyable playing experience for either player, especially with Lancia being mostly a useless card outside of this matchup. It doesn't really help either that the Malice turn take absolutely forever, which make playing against them such a hassle because they waste so much of your time. Being the best deck that was released in the game in 2025, Malice dominate multiple different Duelist Cup, and also being the most represented archetype in the 2025 World Championship alongside Ryzeal. Obviously, the deck received a lot of hits on the ban list by the end of 2025. Most of its powerful starter and extender has been limited to one copy each. One of the best extender Link monster in the Red Ransom is completely gone, plus it has forced Konami to finally ban Appaloosa from the game, which, I guess, it is the one good thing you can say about the release of Malice. But guess what? Even with all of these restrictions, Malice is still doing fine. Sure, it's not the best deck in the game anymore, but it's still a very good and competitive deck, especially with people not really playing Lancia anymore to counter the deck. This is how you can build the deck at the start of 2026 with all of the nerfs applied. You can easily replace any of the consistency they've lost with one of the other millionth way that Cybers can search their monsters. The deck still have most of its power ceiling intact, but you do need to learn to pilot the deck correctly now to maximize its potential. One thing's for sure, this will not be the last you see of Malice. We might have escaped the Red Queen's wrath, but we are not getting out of Wonderland anytime soon. Of course, the other best deck of 2025 that can sort of compete with Malice is Yugioh. Released in the Detonate to the Top Speed pack on August 4th, Yugioh is the best rank 4 team archetype up to date. They can easily swarm the board with level 4 monsters to go into various different rank 4 exene, and mostly rely on the boss monster, Yugioh Detonator, that can pop card on the field per exene material that it has, plus some other in-engine card from the archetype to win them the game. The deck also have pretty good go second capability, due to Yugioh can be used as a form of board breaker when used in tandem with a card like Aggregator. Plus, Yugioh can easily summon Exciton Knight to swing the board back around. Yugioh is just a pretty solid deck that doesn't have much of a weakness. It's definitely not as good as Malice going first, but it's also better than Malice at going second, which is why it does pretty well in the meta and have decent tournament results. It done pretty well for itself in the Duelist Cup, and it is one of the most represented archetype in the Master Duel World Championship alongside Malice, albeit it doesn't have as good of a win rate. Still, it does back itself a couple of nerfs on the ban list, limiting two of its most impactful main deck monster in the X Yugioh and the Sword Yugioh, plus a ban on Baguska. These nerfs were impactful enough that it has pushed the pure variant of Yugioh out of the meta, but it doesn't mean that it is the end for Yugioh. Towards the end of 2025, Konami released another powerful rank 4 engine in the Future Begin Zero pack, that is, the Onomat engine. This is another engine that excels at spamming the board with level 4 monsters, and it has completely elevated Yugioh to a whole new level. From being able to easily enable powerful floodgates like Protoss and Hobby Feather Storm, to being able to head loop the opponent with Heavy Slump if they maxi or full loss you, to literally turn skip the opponent using Ptolemaeus. The deck now has some absurd combo potential that is just straight up unfair. Even if you don't play for one of this combo, Onomat still enable Yugioh to bulldoze to everything when they go first. This version of Yugioh Onomat is actually one of the more tame versions of the deck, even though it still does play Protoss. This is definitely one of the recent breakout deck at the end of 2025, doing pretty well for itself in the most recent Duelist Cup, and proved to be one of the more annoying deck in the meta if Konami doesn't do anything to address it. After a slow start for the year and basically a 2-deck meta of Yugioh and Malice in the middle of 2025, the end of the year is shaping up to have a lot more diverse meta, starting off with the release of the Mitsurugi in the Ruler's Provident pack on October 8th. Mitsurugi is a reptile-themed ritual archetype with the underlying mechanic that their monster, especially the ritual monster, can gain you a bunch of resources when they are being tributed. This mechanic of course complements the ritual theme of Mitsurugi very well, as this is the first ritual deck in a while that is actually competitively viable. Mitsurugi is one of those archetypes that people have a love-hate relationship with. On the one hand, this is the first TCG exclusive archetype that is just really good, but also not too broken. And on the other hand, the archetype is a little bit too generic and can be easily accessible through a King of the Pharaoh Inn. Mitsurugi can be good on their own, or it can be used to complement other engines, especially since they can easily put level 4 and level 8 bodies on the field without any restrictions, and they're also a huge threat in their own right. Funnily enough, despite their popularity on the ladder, Konami did not hit any of the Mitsurugi cards, but instead they hit one of its biggest counter in the Drone Lockwood, so that they can fully enjoy their free range at the end of 2025. This list here is one of the more basic variants that you can play with Mitsurugi. It is mostly a pure version of the deck with the Fistmate engine tossed in for a little bit more power. Of course, both of these engines can easily bridge into one another, which is one of the reasons why this deck can work so well. Mitsurugi is one of the breakout engines of 2025 alongside Fistmate, so you can expect to see a lot more of them in the future, even if they are not good enough on their own. Time will tell if this engine will become a problem in the future. Will we succumb to our snake deities, or will Hamakiri have to tribute itself on the ban list? And here we already have an example of a top tier deck using the Mitsurugi engine. Yugioh Mitsurugi has carved itself a decent spot in the meta just by virtue of being a hyper-consistent deck. The deck doesn't have the same combo potential as a Yugioh Onomat deck, and you typically play a smaller package of Mitsurugi, which means they are mostly one and done type of deal in the deck. What you're trying to do is to have one really explosive turn, where you try to maximize both of these archetypes to overwhelm your opponent. While this deck isn't the most competitive deck in this meta, because it doesn't do any one thing better than other decks, it is still a very good deck to play and climb on the ladder. Moving on to our number 8 deck, we have August. This archetype is one of a surprise breakout deck of Master Duel in 2025 that made a big impact on the meta for a period of time. August received their new support in the same pack as Mitsurugi that really raised the power level of the deck, giving the deck a lot more endward pieces to work with. But the thing that makes the deck really success in Master Duel compared to the physical card game is that we have Nightmare Mermaid unrestricted, which give the deck the consistency boost they needed to be top tier. And this version of the deck right here really take advantage of that. We are playing with a bunch of engine that is really efficient at putting bodies on the field, like Fiendsmith and Millennium, to easily make Nightmare Mermaid. This card wasn't the only reason that this deck found its success in Master Duel though. It also have to do with the timing. The August support was released right at the time when the two best decks in the game, that is Yugioh and Malice, were heavily nerfed, which is where August come in to fill in the gap in the meta. Sadly, their reign was short-lived, as they has completely vanished from the meta when Dracotail came out. To be fair though, Dracotail is a pretty bad matchup for August, as they can easily pop the August Field spell with the Urgula to turn off a lot of disruptions. For now, August has taken a step back from the spotlight, but there's always a potential that they can make a comeback when Dracotail isn't the best deck in the meta anymore. The next deck on the list is no doubt one of Yu-Gi-Oh players' favorite, Sky Striker. This fan favorite archetype do receive some support every once in a while, but this time it is actually good enough to push the deck into meta relevant. This wave of support in the Future Begin Zero pack saw a new powerful Link monster that both boost the deck consistency and be a form of disruption. Also, there is a much needed spell card that can recycle their monster and spells from the grave, which fixed one of the main weaknesses that Sky Striker has before. This is a cookie cutter way that you can build the deck after the new support. Do keep in mind though that this deck is highly flexible in terms of its deck building and can pretty much adapt to any meta. I do recommend you check out my friend Frozen by Icebeam channel to see some of the most creative way you can play Skyjacker out there. Also, shout out to him for helping me with the replays for this Skyjacker portion of the video. Coming up on our 10th deck on the list, we have Lunar Light. This is another legacy deck that has found success with their new support in 2025. Also released in the Future Begin Zero pack, the standout card that they receive is Lunar Light Liger Dancer. That is an unaffected 3800 attack monster with a quick effect to destroy all special summon monster your opponent control. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh is no stranger to tower monster, but this one take it to another level. Not only can Lunar Light very consistently summon a Liger Dancer, they can also do it twice. Most decks in the game cannot deal with that, and you also cannot really play tech cards against them in a best of 1 format like Master Duel without substantially weakening your deck, which is why this deck is quite a bit on the meta right now. A Lunar Light list is mostly already been solved, with this version of the deck is basically the best way you can build it. Besides the normal way you can summon Liger Dancer, you can also cheat it out going second by using Heavy Polymerization, which is such a sacky card in this deck honestly. There's really not much room for experimentation with the deck, because the archetype already has such a clear path to victory that it would be kinda foolish to try to do anything else. Lunar Light is a deck that will have its rise and fall in the meta, depending on whether the best deck in the game can beat it. But even if you do consistently beat the best deck in the game, you might still just lose to a random rogue deck because they run the Rumor or Lava Golem. The Diabell Store storyline finished off strong with the new support to White Forest and new powerful Diabell cards. Their support came in a separate bonus pack at the end of November that gave the deck a lot of new tools to play with. Now with both the Azumina engine and the Diabell cards in their arsenal, White Forest can make a lot of plays during their turn that prove to be unstoppable once they get going. This version of White Forest also incorporates the Fiendsmith engine to help with consistency by using Sprite Sprint and Rex Tremblay to bridge into White Forest. Of course, the problem with White Forest is that it's a combo deck in a format where Maxi and Full Loss is legal, so the deck might not be the best deck on this list in terms of its win rate, but it's still a very fun and powerful deck overall. We are closing off 2025 strong with the last pack of the year, giving us new deck types that will completely change the meta of Master Duel. Dracotail is the new top dog in town at the end of 2025. Released in the Aerial Superiority Pack, Dracotail is a fusion-themed archetype with a focus on dragons and spellcaster monsters. They strike a balance between utilizing powerful fusion monster and powerful traps to control the game state and gaining value over your opponent. And while Dracotail is a very strong deck, it is also one of the more healthy decks that we have had in Master Duel because it promotes an interactive gameplay and their turn are very short. This list is one of the most popular ways you can play with Dracotail. It utilizes a very powerful branded fusion to enable both your Dracotail monster and your branded engine. There are also quite a few other variants of the deck that is also pretty great. That is another nice thing about Dracotail. There are a lot of different builds with the deck and they each have their own unique advantage, but they are still pretty close in terms of their power level. The point is that you can have a lot of creativity with the deck. 2025 might have been a bad year for Master Duel in general because of Malice and Ryziel, but the Dracotail meta is definitely healing. If this is gonna be an indication for the future, then 2026 will be a great year for Master Duel. And here is also a final bonus deck for you guys. It is Odeon, or as it's commonly known as, the main deck. This package was released alongside Dragotail that consists of a bunch of cards themed around a character from the first series of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, hence the name Odeon. This deck is actually a pretty competent trap deck that can set up multiple negates and have an amazing recycle engine. There is a few different builds of Odeon, but I am highlighting a more pure version of the deck here that run more in-engine cards and also rely on some floodgate to start the game. Sadly, most build of Odeon is quite expensive since they do rely on using the dominance cards to defend themselves for when going second. But if you do happen to have them, then this deck is definitely a very chill deck to play and still get a decent result with. There is also a few more decks that I want to mention that I think is also very good, but I don't have the replay for them because I don't have the cards, so I will put them here. The first deck that deserves an honorable mention is Mermail Atlantean. This deck received a new wave of support in the Wrath of the Tyrants pack back in May. This deck is built to basically abuse Atlantean Dragoon effects as much as possible, which is the glue that holds this deck together. And from there, they can employ several different strategies to win. The most annoying of them all is that they can rip the majority of cards out of your hand by using the Water Elemental Lord and cards like Deep Sea Minstrel and Trishula. If that wasn't good enough, their second go-to play is to summon the Water Barrier statue using the Prima Donna. They are also pretty good at spamming the board with monster to go into various link and synchro monster. Because this deck relies heavily on Dragoon, it does have a glaring weakness against Draw and Lockbird, which is a very popular hand trap in the meta ever since Yugioh and Mitsurugi release. And of course this deck is not as consistent as those two decks. But this deck is still very good on ladder when it's in a good player's hand. Next, we have Crystron. This was a pretty popular deck back when the support for it was released in the Perpetual Maze Selection pack. This deck can utilize various graveyard effects to swarm the board with monster and can synchro summon during the opponent's turn. The deck does mostly restrict you into using machine type monster from the extra deck only, so there is limited options that the deck can play with. This deck was released at just the right time for it to shine, because it came out right before Manas hit the meta and a lot of top decks in the game at that moment were also being nerfed. Crystron is a pretty competent deck, but it has fallen out of favor in recent times because it can't keep up with some of the newer release archetypes. With that being said though, Crystron do have a good future to look forward to. This deck is efficient at putting out level 5 body on the field, which means that it has very good synergy with the K9 card whenever they came out. Another deck that is very good this year is Memento. This deck is pretty convoluted with their effects, but basically they want to send as many of the Memento cards from their deck to the grave as possible to summon the boss monster, the Combined Creation, which they can then either give it piercing attack or the ability to attack directly for game. This deck received the new support in the Onslaught of the Emperor's pack that give it a new fusion monster and a new fusion enabler. This is another deck that is very efficient at putting a lot of bodies on the field, and importantly it can summon quite a few level 5 bodies, which they have used this ability in the past to abuse several different floodgates, namely the Paradise Smasher and the Quinquerry Princess, to summon the artifact Mjolnir. After these two cards were banned for obvious reasons, this deck is more or less has disappeared from the meta. While the deck is not bad by any means, it takes more time to learn and to master this deck than some of the other archetypes, so it deters a lot of people from picking it up. But if you can stick it out with it, then this deck is definitely capable to put out some pretty awesome highlight moments. Last but not least, we have Gem Knight. This archetype does pretty well for itself in Master Duel when its new support came out, because we are the only format that do have Brilliant Fusion at 3. This new wave of support basically turned Gem Knight into an OTK machine that can even rival something like Tenpai. While this is what they were designed to do, there is also a Go First version of Gem Knight that is also pretty good. Of course, the way that they can do that is by abusing a floodgate. Yeah, you can see the trend with the decks that I'm listing here, right? The deck was abusing Christia until of course the card got eventually banned. But there's still a lot more floodgate where that came from. This list is using Fossil Dyna because you don't even need to use your normal summon in this deck if you open the fusion spells. It is not as good as Christia of course, but it still basically does exactly the same thing. The one nice thing about the Gem Knight cards is that they are very attackable in other decks too, which make them a pretty worthwhile investment. 2025 has been quite a roller coaster for Master Duel. The beginning of the year were mostly quiet, with a lot of old decks still make the majority of the meta, while the latter portion of the year were completely dominated by one or two archetypes. For the best 3 decks of the year, I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that Malice took home the trophy here. This is probably not only just the best deck of this year, but probably one of the best decks ever made. Similarly, the second best deck of the year goes to Yugioh. It is just a very efficient and simple deck to pilot. The deck also has several different variants throughout the year that help keep it relevant in the meta. In the third slot, I am putting Dracotail. Although it is a latecomer to the party, it has already proven itself to be a very strong deck, and it's gonna stay relevant in the meta for a foreseeable future. In terms of the actual playing experience with the deck, the number 1 deck of the year for me has got to be Dracotail. This is one of the few decks in the game that is actually fun to play and to play against, mostly since the deck is more of a control deck than a combo deck, unlike many other top tier decks of 2025. It also helps with the playing experience of Dragotail a lot when your opponent doesn't just concede midway to your combos, which means you can actually interact with your opponent. And for the worst deck in terms of its playing experience, I'm gonna put Lulalai. This deck doesn't do anything outside of summoning Live Dancer. At least with some decks like Mermail and Gem Knight, your deck can still actually do something outside of floodgating your opponent. For Lulalai though, it's really just all or nothing. It also gonna feel extra bad if your opponent do have a way to out your Live Dancer. And on the flip side, it also really isn't that fun to play against Lulalai either, because you can already tell if you're gonna win or lose the game, depending on what deck you're playing. Now for some archetype that was released in 2025 that I think will have the most chance to become meta relevant in the future. The first archetype to keep an eye on is Regenesis. They have a lot of big monsters with powerful disruption effects and the ability to recycle themselves continuously. This archetype can easily slot into any future decks that have a control strategy and can easily summon monsters with 25,000 attack or defense. The next archetype to keep an eye on is Novell. This ritual focused archetype has a lot of good things going for them. They have pretty generic support for ritual decks, and they have tie-in with the Fiendsmith engine because one of their best cards is Light Fiend. So they do have the potential to become a very good deck with new support for ritual coming in, or they might also get used in other ritual decks as a supporting engine. The last deck that I think will also have a very good future is of course Archmage. The deck is not very good right now, but of course, with it being a part of a low archetype, there will definitely be a lot more support coming in, and with every new card that they receive, there is a potential new ways to break the deck. And with that, we are gonna close out the video. I hope you guys have fun, take a look back at the best deck of Master Duel in 2025. What were the deck that you enjoyed the most in 2025? Is there one deck that you think I should have made this list? And what archetype are you excited for in the future? Well, let's hope that 2026 will have a better and more diverse meta than the one we have in 2025.